Chapter 25. In the Sviazhsky district there was no railway nor service of post horses, and Levin drove there with his own horses in his big old-fashioned carriage. He stopped halfway at a well-to-do peasant's to feed his horses. A bald, well-preserved old man with a broad red beard, gray on his cheeks, opened the gate, squeezing against the gate-post to let the 3 horses pass. Directing the coachman to a place under the shed in the big, clean, tidy yard, with charred, old-fashioned plows in it, the old man asked Levin to come into the parlor. A cleanly dressed young woman, with clogs on her bare feet, was scrubbing the floor in the new outer room. She was frightened of the dog that ran in after Levin and uttered a shriek, but began laughing at her own fright at once when she was told the dog would not hurt her. Pointing Levin with her bare arm to the door into the parlor, she bent down again, hiding her handsome face, and went on scrubbing. "Would you like the samovar?" she asked. "Yes, please." The parlor was a big room with a Dutch stove and a screen dividing it into 2. Under the holy picture stood a table painted in patterns, a bench, and 2 chairs. Near the entrance was a dresser full of crockery. The shutters were closed, there were few flies, and it was so clean that Levin was anxious that Laska, who had been running along the road and bathing in puddles, should not muddy the floor, and ordered her to a place in the corner by the door. After looking round the parlor, Levin went out in the backyard. The good-looking young woman in clogs, swinging the empty pails on the yoke, ran on before him to the well for water. "Look sharp, my girl," the old man shouted after her good-humoredly, and he went up to Levin. "Well, sir, are you going to see Nikolay Ivanovitch Sviazhsky? His honor comes to us, too," he began, chatting, leaning his elbows on the railing of the steps. In the middle of the old man's account of his acquaintance with Sviazhsky, the gates creaked again, and laborers came into the yard from the fields, with wooden plows and harrows. The horses harnessed to the plows and harrows were sleek and fat. The laborers were obviously of the household. 2 young men were in cotton shirts and caps. The 2 others were hired laborers in homespun shirts, one an old man, the other a young fellow. Moving off from the steps, the old man went up to the horses and began unharnessing them. "What have they been plowing?" asked Levin. "Plowing up the potatoes. We rent a bit of land, too. Fed up? Don't let the gelding out, but take it to the trough. We'll put the other in harness." "Oh, father, the plowshares I ordered, has he brought them along?" asked the big, healthy-looking fellow, obviously the old man's son. "There, in the outer room," answered the old man, bundling together the harness he had taken off and flinging it on the ground. "You can put them on while they have dinner." The good-looking young woman came into the outer room with the full pails dragging on her shoulders. More women came onto the scene from somewhere, young and handsome, middle-aged, old, with children and without children. The samovar was beginning to sing. The laborers and the family, having disposed of the horses, came in to dinner. Levin, getting his provisions out of his carriage, invited the old man to take tea with him. "Well, I have had some already today," said the old man, obviously accepting the invitation with pleasure, "but just a glass for company." Over their tea, Levin heard about all the old man's farming. 10 years before, the old man had rented 300 acres from the lady who owned them, and a year ago he had bought them and rented another 300 from a neighboring landowner. A small part of the land, the worst part, he let out for rent, while 100 acres of arable land he cultivated himself with his family and 2 hired laborers. The old man complained that things were doing badly, but Levin saw that he simply did so from a feeling of propriety, and that his farm was in a flourishing condition. If it had been unsuccessful, he would not have bought land at 35 rubles an acre. He would not have married his 3 sons and a nephew. He would not have rebuilt twice after fires, and each time on a larger scale. In spite of the old man's complaints, it was evident that he was proud, and justly proud, of his prosperity, proud of his sons, his nephew, his sons' wives, his horses, his cows, and especially of the fact that he was keeping all this farming going. From his conversation with the old man, Levin thought he was not averse to new methods either. He had planted a great many potatoes, and his potatoes, as Levin had seen driving past, were already past flowering and beginning to die down, while Levin's were only just coming into flower. He earthed up his potatoes with a modern plow borrowed from a neighboring landowner. He sowed wheat. The trifling fact that, thinning out his rye, the old man used the rye he thinned out for his horses, especially struck Levin. How many times had Levin seen the splendid fodder wasted and tried to get it saved, but always it had turned out to be impossible. The peasant got this done, and he could not say enough in praise of it as food for the beast. What have the women to do? They carry it out in bundles to the roadside, and the cart brings it away. Well, we landowners can't manage well with our laborers, said Levin, handing him a glass of tea. Thank you, said the old man, and he took the glass but refused sugar, pointing to a lump he had left. They're simple destruction, said he. Look at Sviazhsky's, for instance. We know what the land is like, first rate, yet there's not much of a crop to boast of. It's not looked after enough, that's all it is. But you work your land with hired laborers? We're all peasants together. We go into everything ourselves. If a man's no use, he can go, and we can manage by ourselves. Father, Finnegan wants some tar, said the young woman in the clogs, coming in. Yes, that's how it is, sir, said the old man, getting up and crossing himself deliberately. He thanked Levin and went out. When Levin went into the kitchen to call his coachman, he saw the whole family at dinner. The women were standing up, waiting on them. The young, sturdy-looking son was telling something funny with his mouth full of pudding, and they were all laughing. The woman in the clogs, who was pouring cabbage soup into a bowl, laughing most merrily of all. Very probably the good-looking face of the young woman in the clogs had a good deal to do with the impression of well-being this peasant household made upon Levin. But the impression was so strong that Levin could never get rid of it, and all the way from the old peasants to Sviazhsky's, he kept recalling this peasant farm as though there was something in this impression that demanded his special attention. Chapter 26. Sviazhsky was the marshal of his district. He was 5 years older than Levin and had long been married. His sister-in-law, a young girl Levin liked very much, lived in his house, and Levin knew that Sviazhsky and his wife would have greatly liked to marry the girl to him. He knew this with certainty, as so-called eligible young men always know it, though he could never have brought himself to speak of it to anyone. And he knew, too, that although he wanted to get married, and although by every token this very attractive girl would make an excellent wife, he could no more have married her, even if he had not been in love with Kitty Sviazhskaya, than he could have flown up to the sky. And that knowledge poisoned the pleasure he had hoped to find in his visit to Sviazhsky. On getting Sviazhsky's letter with the invitation for shooting, Levin had immediately thought of this. But in spite of this, he had made up his mind that Sviazhsky's having such views for him was simply his own groundless supposition, and so he would go all the same. Besides, at the bottom of his heart he had a desire to try himself, put himself to the test in regard to this girl. The Sviazhsky's home life was exceedingly pleasant, and Sviazhsky himself, the best type of man taking part in local affairs that Levin knew, was very interesting to him. Sviazhsky was one of those people, always a source of wonder to Levin, whose convictions, very logical though never original, go one way by themselves, while their life, exceedingly definite and firm in its direction, goes its way quite apart and almost always in direct contradiction to their convictions. Sviazhsky was an extremely advanced man. He despised the nobility and believed the mass of the nobility to be secretly in favor of serfdom, and only concealing their views from cowardice. He regarded Russia as a ruined country, rather after the style of Turkey, and the government of Russia as so bad that he never permitted himself to criticize its doings seriously. And yet he was a functionary of that government, in a model marshal of nobility, and when he drove about he always wore the cockade of office and the cap with the red band. He considered human life only tolerable abroad, and went abroad to stay at every opportunity. And at the same time he carried on a complex and improved system of agriculture in Russia, and with extreme interest followed everything and knew everything that was being done in Russia. He considered the Russian peasant as occupying a stage of development intermediate between the ape and the man. And at the same time, in the local assemblies, no one was readier to shake hands with the peasants and listen to their opinion. He believed neither in God nor the devil, but was much concerned about the question of the improvement of the clergy and the maintenance of their revenues, and took special trouble to keep up the church in his village. On the woman question, he was on the side of the extreme advocate of complete liberty for women, and especially their right to labor. But he lived with his wife on such terms that their affectionate childless home life was the admiration of everyone, and arranged his wife's life so that she did nothing and could do nothing but share her husband's efforts that her time should pass as happily and agreeably as possible. If it had not been a characteristic of Levin's to put the most favorable interpretation on people, Sviazhsky's character would have presented no doubt or difficulty to him. He would have said to himself, a fool or a knave, and everything would have seemed clear. But he could not say a fool, because Sviazhsky was unmistakably clever, and moreover a highly cultured man who was exceptionally modest over his culture. There was not a subject he knew nothing of, but he did not display his knowledge except when he was compelled to do so. Still less Levin could say he was a knave, as Sviazhsky was unmistakably an honest, good-hearted, sensible man, who worked good-humoredly, keenly, and perseveringly at his work. He was held in high honor by everyone about him, and certainly he had never consciously done, and was indeed incapable of doing, anything base. Levin tried to understand him, and could not understand him, and looked at him and his life as a living enigma. Levin and he were very friendly, so Levin used to venture to sound Sviazhsky, to try to get at the very foundation of his view of life, but it was always in vain. Every time Levin tried to penetrate beyond the outer chambers of Sviazhsky's mind, which were hospitably open to all, he noticed that Sviazhsky was slightly disconcerted. Faint signs of alarm were visible in his eyes, as though he were afraid Levin would understand him, and he would just give him a kindly, good-humored repulse. Just now, since his disenchantment with farming, Levin was particularly glad to stay with Sviazhsky. Apart from the fact that the sight of this happy and affectionate couple, so pleased with themselves and everyone else, and their well-ordered home had always a cheering effect on Levin. He felt a longing, now that he was so dissatisfied with his own life, to get at that secret in Sviazhsky that gave him such clearness, definiteness, and good courage in life. Moreover, Levin knew that at Sviazhsky's he should meet the landowners of the neighborhood, and it was particularly interesting to him, just now, to hear and take part in those rural conversations concerning crops, laborers' wages, and so on, which, he was aware, are conventionally regarded as something very low, but which seemed to him just now to constitute the one subject of importance. It was not, perhaps, of importance in the days of serfdom, and it may not be of importance in England. In both cases, the conditions of agriculture are firmly established. But among us now, when everything has been turned upside down and is only just taking shape, the question what form these conditions will take is the one question of importance in Russia, thought Levin. The shooting turned out to be worse than Levin had expected. The marsh was dry, and there were no grouse at all. He walked about the whole day and only brought back 3 birds. But to make up for that, he brought back, as he always did from shooting, an excellent appetite, excellent spirits, and that keen intellectual mood with which him always accompanied violent physical exertion. And while out shooting, when he seemed to be thinking of nothing at all, suddenly the old man and his family kept coming back in his mind, and the impression of them seemed to claim not merely his attention, but the solution of some question connected with them. In the evening at tea, 2 landowners, who had come about some business connected with the wardship, were of the party, and the interesting conversation Levin had been looking for sprang up. Levin was sitting beside his hostess at the tea-table, and he was obliged to keep up a conversation with her and her sister, who were sitting opposite him. Madame Sviazhskaya was a round-faced, fair-haired, rather short woman, all smiles and dimples. Levin tried through her to get a solution of the weighty enigma her husband presented to his mind, but he had not complete freedom of ideas, because he was in an agony of embarrassment. This agony of embarrassment was due to the fact that the sister-in-law was sitting opposite to him, in a dress specially put on, as he fancied, for his benefit, cut particularly open in the shape of a trapeze on her white bosom. This quadrangular opening, in spite of the bosom's being very white, or just because it was very white, deprived Levin of the full use of his faculties. He imagined, probably mistakenly, that this low-necked bodice had been made on his account, and felt that he had no right to look at it, and tried not to look at it. But he felt that he was to blame for the very fact of the low-necked bodice having been made. It seemed to Levin that he had deceived someone, that he ought to explain something, but to explain it was impossible, and for that reason he was continually blushing, was ill at ease and awkward. His awkwardness infected the pretty sister-in-law too, but their hostess appeared not to observe this, and kept purposely drawing her into the conversation. "You say," she said, pursuing the subject that had been started, "that my husband cannot be interested in what's Russian. It's quite the contrary. He is always in cheerful spirits abroad, but not as he is here. Here he feels in his proper place. He has so much to do, and he has the faculty of interesting himself in everything. Oh, you've not been to see our school, have you?" "I've seen it. The little house covered with ivy, isn't it?" "Yes, that was Nastia's work," she said, indicating her sister. "You'd teach in it yourself?" asked Levin, trying to look above the open neck, but feeling that wherever he looked in that direction he should end up seeing it. "Yes, I used to teach in it myself, and do teach still, but we have a first-rate schoolmistress now, and we've started gymnastic exercises." "No, thank you. No more tea," said Levin, and conscious of doing a rude thing, but incapable of continuing the conversation, he got up, blushing. "I hear a very interesting conversation," he added, and walked to the other end of the table, where Sviazhsky was sitting with the two gentlemen of the neighborhood. Sviazhsky was sitting sideways, with one elbow on the table and a cup in one hand, while with the other hand he gathered up his beard, held it to his nose, and let it drop again, as though he were smelling it. His brilliant black eyes were looking straight at the excited country gentleman with gray whiskers, and apparently he derived amusement from his remarks. The gentleman was complaining of the peasants. It was evident to Levin that Sviazhsky knew an answer to this gentleman's complaints, which would at once demolish his whole contention, but that in his position he could not give utterance to this answer, and listened not without pleasure to the landowner's comic speeches. The gentleman with the gray whiskers was obviously an inveterate adherent of serfdom and a devoted agriculturalist, who had lived all his life in the country. Levin saw proofs of this in his dress, in the old-fashioned threadbare coat, obviously not his everyday attire, in his shrewd, deep-set eyes, in his idiomatic, fluent Russian, in the imperious tone that had become habitual from long use, and in the resolute gestures of his large, red, sunburnt hands, with an old betrothal ring on the little finger. Chapter 27. "If I'd only the heart to throw up what's been set going, such a lot of trouble wasted, I'd turn my back on the whole business, sell up and go off like Nikolay Ivanovitch to hear Les Belles Hélènes," said the landowner, a pleasant smile lighting up his shrewd old face. "But you see, you don't throw it up," said Nikolay Ivanovitch Sviazhsky, "so there must be something gained." "The only gain is that I live in my own house, neither bought nor hired. Besides, one keeps hoping the people will learn sense. Though, instead of that, you'd never believe it, the drunkenness, the immorality. They keep chopping and changing their bits of land. Not a sight of a horse or a cow. The peasant's dying of hunger, but just go and take him on as a laborer. He'll do his best to do you mischief, and then bring you up before the justice of the peace." "But you make complaints to the justice, too," said Sviazhsky. "I? Lodge complaints? Not for anything in the world. Such a talking and such a to-do that one would have cause to regret it. At the works, for instance, they pocketed the advance money and made off. What did the justice do? Acquitted them. Nothing keeps them in order but their own communal court and their village elder. He'll flog them in the good old style. But for that, there'd be nothing for it but to give it all up and run away." Obviously, the landowner was chaffing Sviazhsky, who, far from resenting it, was apparently amused by it. "But you see, we manage our land without such extreme measures," said he, smiling. "Levin and I and this gentleman." He indicated the other landowner. "Yes, the thing's done at Mihail Petrovitch's, but ask him how it's done. Do you call that a rational system?" said the landowner, obviously rather proud of the word rational. "My system's very simple," said Mihail Petrovitch. "Thank God. All my management rests on getting the money ready for the autumn taxes, and the peasants come to me. 'Father, master, help us.' While the peasants are all one's neighbors, one feels for them, so one advances them a third, but one says, 'Remember, lads, I have helped you, and you must help me when I need it, whether it's sowing of the oats or the hay cutting or the harvest.' And well, one agrees. So much for each taxpayer, though there are dishonest ones among them too, it's true. Levin, who had long been familiar with these patriarchal methods, exchanged glances with Sviazhsky and interrupted Mihail Petrovitch, turning again to the gentleman with the gray whiskers. "Then what do you think?" he asked. "What system is one to adopt nowadays?" "Why, manage the land like Mihail Petrovitch, or let the land for half the crop or the rent to the peasants. That one can do. Only that's just how the general prosperity of the country is being ruined. Where the land with serf labor and good management gave a good yield of 9-1, on the half-crop system it yields 3-1. Russia has been ruined by emancipation." Sviazhsky looked with smiling eyes at Levin, and even made a faint gesture of irony to him, but Levin did not think the landowner's words absurd. He understood them better than he did Sviazhsky. A great deal more of what the gentleman with the gray whiskers said to show in what way Russia was ruined by the emancipation struck him indeed as very true. New to him, and quite incontestable, the landowner unmistakably spoke his own individual thought, a thing that very rarely happens, and a thought to which he had been brought not by a desire of finding some exercise for an idle brain, but a thought which had grown up out of the condition of his life, which he had brooded over in the solitude of his village, and had considered in every aspect. "The point is, don't you see, that progress of every sort is only made by the use of authority," he said, evidently wishing to show he was not without culture. "Take the reforms of Peter, of Catherine, of Alexander. Take European history, and progress in agriculture more than anything else. The potato, for instance, that was introduced among us by force. The wooden plow, too, wasn't always used. It was introduced maybe in the days before the Empire, but it was probably brought in by force. Now, in our own day, we landowners in the serf times used various improvements in our husbandry, drying machines and thrashing machines and carting manure and all the modern implements, all that we brought into use by our authority, and the peasants opposed it at first, and ended by imitating us. Now, by the abolition of serfdom, we have been deprived of our authority. And so our husbandry, where it has been raised to a high level, is bound to sink to the most savage primitive condition. That's how I see it." "But why so? If it's rational, you'll be able to keep up the same system with hired labor," said Sviazhsky. "We've no power over them. With whom am I going to work the system? Allow me to ask that." "There it is, the labor force, the chief element in agriculture," thought Levin. "With laborers. The laborers won't work well, and won't work with good implements. Our laborer can do nothing but get drunk like a pig, and when he's drunk he ruins everything you give him. He makes the houses ill with too much water, cuts good harness, barters the tires of the wheels for drink, drops bits of iron into the thrashing machine so as to break it. He loathes the sight of anything that's not after his fashion. And that's how it is the whole level of husbandry has fallen. Lands gone out of cultivation, overgrown with weeds, or divided among the peasants, and where millions of bushels were raised, you get 100,000. The wealth of the country has decreased. If the same thing had been done, but with care, that—" and he proceeded to unfold his whole scheme of emancipation by means of which these drawbacks might have been avoided. This did not interest Levin, but when he had finished, Levin went back to his first position, and addressing Sviazhsky and trying to draw him into expressing his serious opinion, that the standard of culture is falling, and that with our present relations for the peasants, there is no possibility of farming of a rational system to yield a profit, "That is perfectly true," said he. "I don't believe it," Sviazhsky replied quite seriously. "All I see is that we don't know how to cultivate the land, and that our system of agriculture in the serf days was by no means too high, but too low. We have no machines, no good stock, no efficient supervision. We don't even know how to keep accounts. Ask any landowner, he won't be able to tell you what crop's profitable and what's not." "Italian bookkeeping," said the gentleman of the gray whiskers ironically. "You may keep your books as you like, but if they spoil everything for you, there won't be any profit." "Why do they spoil things? A poor thrashing machine or your Russian presser, they will break, but my steam press they won't break. A wretched Russian nag they'll ruin, but keep good dray horses, they won't ruin them. And so it is all around. We must raise our farming to a higher level." "Oh, if one only had the means to do it. Nikolay Ivanovitch, it's all very well for you, but for me, with a son to keep at the university, lads to be educated at the high school, how am I going to buy dray horses?" "Well, that's what the land banks are for." "To get what's left me sold by auction? No, thank you." "I don't agree that it's necessary or possible to raise the level of agriculture still higher," said Levin. "I devote myself to it, and I have means, but I can do nothing. As to the banks, I don't know to whom they're any good. For my part, anyway, whatever I've spent money on in the way of husbandry, it has been a loss. Stock, a loss. Machinery, a loss." "That's true enough," the gentleman with the gray whiskers chimed in, positively laughing with satisfaction. "And I'm not the only one," pursued Levin. "I mix with all the neighboring landowners who are cultivating their land on a rational system. They all, with rare exceptions, are doing so at a loss. Come, tell us, how does your land do? Does it pay?" said Levin. And at once in Sviazhsky's eyes he detected that fleeting expression of alarm which he had noticed whenever he tried to penetrate beyond the outer chambers of Sviazhsky's mind. Moreover, this question on Levin's part was not quite in good faith. Madame Sviazhskaya had just told him at tea that they had that summer invited a German expert in bookkeeping from Moscow, who, for a consideration of 500 rubles, had investigated the management of the property and found that it was costing them a loss of 3,000 odd rubles. She did not remember the precise sum, but it appeared that the German had worked it out to a fraction of a farthing. The gray-whiskered landowner smiled at the mention of the profits of Sviazhsky's farming, obviously aware how much gain his neighbor and marshal was likely to be making. "Possibly it does not pay," answered Sviazhsky. "That merely proves either that I'm a bad manager or that I've sunk my capital for the increase of my rents." "Oh, rent!" Levin cried with horror. "Rent there may be in Europe, where land has been improved by the labor put into it, but with us all the land is deteriorating from the labor put into it. In other words, they're working it out, so there's no question of rent." "How no rent? It's a law." "Then we're outside the law. Rent explains nothing for us, but simply muddles us. No, tell me, how can there be a theory of rent?" "Masha, pass us some junket or raspberries." He turned to his wife. "Extraordinarily late the raspberries are lasting this year." And in the happiest frame of mind, Sviazhsky got up and walked off, apparently supposing the conversation to have ended at the very point when to Levin it seemed that it was only just beginning. Having lost his antagonist, Levin continued the conversation with the gray-whiskered landowner, trying to prove to him that all the difficulty arises from the fact that we don't find out the peculiarities and habits of our laborer. But the landowner, like all men who think independent and in isolation, was slow in taking in any other person's idea, and particularly partial to his own. He stuck to it that the Russian peasant is a swine and likes swinishness, and that to get him out of his swinishness one must have authority, and there is none. One must have the stick, and we have become so liberal that we have all of a sudden replaced the stick that served us for 1,000 years by lawyers in model prisons, where the worthless stinking peasant is fed on good soup and has a fixed allowance of cubic feet of air. What makes you think, sir, trying to get back to the question, that it's impossible to find some relation to the laborer in which the labor would become productive? That could never be with the Russian peasantry. We've no power over them, answered the landowner. How can new conditions be found? Asked Sviazhsky. Having just eaten some junket and lighted a cigarette, he came back to the discussion. All possible relations to the labor force have been defined and studied. The relic of barbarism, the primitive commune with each guarantee for all, will disappear of itself. Serfdom has been abolished. There remains nothing but free labor, and its forms are fixed and ready-made, and must be adopted. Permanent hands, day laborers, rammers, you can't get out of those forms. But Europe is dissatisfied with these forms. Dissatisfied and seeking new ones, and will find them in all probability. That's just what I was meaning, answered Levin. Why shouldn't we seek them for ourselves? Because it would be just like inventing afresh the means for constructing railways. They are ready, invented. But if they don't do for us, if they're stupid, said Levin. And again he detected the expression of alarm in the eyes of Sviazhsky. Oh, yes, we'll bury the world under our caps. We found the secret Europe was seeking for. I've heard all that. But, excuse me, do you know all that's been done in Europe on the question of the organization of labor? No, very little. That question is now absorbing the best minds in Europe. The Sviazhsky movement, and then all this enormous literature on the labor question. The most liberal movements. That's a fact by now, as you're probably aware. I have some idea of it, but very vague. No, you only say that. No doubt you know all about it as well as I do. I'm not a professor of sociology, of course, but it interested me, and really, if it interests you, you ought to study it. But what conclusion have they come to? Excuse me. The two neighbors had risen, and Sviazhsky, once more checking Levin in his inconvenient habit of peeping into what was beyond the outer chambers of his mind, went to see his guest out.